All right, welcome to Chapter 8 on adolescence. I think you're going to enjoy this chapter in part because maybe you're not too far out from adolescence and so you can remember a lot about this developmental stage. And if you happen to have any family members who are also in this stage, I'd encourage you to share this chapter with them. I got my kids to read it and take some of your test questions on it in the summer in order to earn video. All right, so let's get started. So revisiting Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, you can see that adolescence is a time of identity development. Now, I would imagine that we're really working on our identities throughout our lives, and certainly, as we might imagine, it's not like once we've finished adolescence, we're done with identity development, but this is a time when we are trying to kind of figure out who we are. And this will also extend into the emerging adulthood stage, which Erikson didn't have, but we now talk about as a separate stage before we get to young adulthood. All right, let's start with physical development, and then we'll move on to cognitive and social and emotional. Let's start by talking about the biological changes of puberty. So an increased percentage of body fat triggers the hypothalamus, which is a bean-sized structure in the limbic system of your brain, to then trigger the ovaries or the testes to produce hormones. Estrogens, the most common of which is estradiol, and androgens, the most common of which is testosterone. And as you've probably heard before, both males and females have estrogens and androgens. Estradiol is 8 times higher in females than it was prior to puberty and twice as high in males. Testosterone is 20 times higher in males than it was prior to puberty and 4 times higher in females. So the primary sex characteristics are referred to as spermarchy and menarchy, kind of odd words. So spermarchy is the development of sperm in the testicles and the first ejaculation, usually in the form of a wet dream. And menarchy is basically menstruation for females getting their period. Girls have been born with all their ova, but when one egg begins to mature and girls are now ovulating, then it's menarchy. And so these two events, menarchy and spermarchy, are often used to mark kind of official puberty because it's a little bit easier to note those than the secondary sex characteristics that you see there. Hair growth, breast development, changes in height and weight, changes in kind of skin and sweat, and particularly for males, voice changes. Okay, so the timing listed in this chart is based on white US and British adolescents, and there's cultural differences across other areas of the world talked about in your textbook. There's a fair amount of variation, but you can see that girls on average show changes earlier than boys. So this graph just shows us that the timing of puberty is decreasing. Basically, we're going through puberty sooner. This is for females, and it says age at menarchy on the left sidebar there, and it's for selected developed countries. And in 1840, you can see the average age of puberty was 17, whereas by 1980, the average age was 12 and a half. Boys haven't been studied as much as girls, but recent evidence says that boys are also achieving puberty earlier in the US. Basically, over the last 20 years, they've gone from anywhere between 6 months to 2 years earlier. Okay, so let's talk more about the timing of puberty and why it is happening earlier on average. So the average age of menarchy is lowest in industrialized countries, and we believe this is due primarily to nutrition and medical care. So advances in our food production technology and advances in medical care have basically increased our nutrition and our health, which has led to earlier ages of puberty. Other reasons are low birth weight, because interestingly this leads to more insulin production, which can then lead, because the body's trying to kind of ensure its survival by gaining weight, but this can sometimes either lead to obesity or it can overstimulate sex hormones. And so now that more kids who were born low birth weight are surviving, that also contributes to the earlier timing of puberty. Interestingly, light exposure is another factor. So kids who go through or who live near the equator go through puberty earlier because they have less melatonin being produced. And so melatonin also seems to be sensitive to artificial light. So basically, perhaps all of our exposure to our artificial light is contributing to earlier puberty. So as we might imagine, someone who is thin and doesn't get much light exposure should go through puberty later. Endocrine disruptors, these are various chemicals and plastics and cleaning supplies and everything that we're exposed to, seem to be another factor. Of course, there is a genetic reaction range, so you are going to be influenced by when your biological parents went through puberty. And then lastly is family environment. So there has been a history of research basically showing that the more kind of positive family environment a child has, like parent-child warmth or cohesion, the later they are likely to go through puberty, obviously within their genetic reaction range. And research also suggests that harsh parenting or child maltreatment, for example, predict earlier puberty in daughters. Yet again, this seems to be based on differential susceptibility, at least in some initial research that found that it's really the orchids who are influenced by what's happening in their family in terms of timing of puberty and not the dandelions. So orchids who have supportive families are more likely to go through puberty later, orchids and slower. And orchids who don't have supportive families are more likely to go through puberty earlier and faster. Okay, so in terms of the timing of puberty, perhaps it might surprise you to find that there's generally negative effects for going through puberty early, particularly for girls. And you can see that list up there. So depressed mood, more negative body image, more risk for eating disorders, more long-term risk for heart disease and breast cancer, not in the short term, more risk for earlier sexual activity, pregnancy, substance use, higher amounts of school problems, and parent conflict. And basically how we make sense of this is that girls who go through puberty earlier attract the attention of older classmates, maybe particularly males, but also girls. And so they start running with an older crowd, and so start engaging in some of the riskier behaviors earlier. The research on boys in timing of puberty has been more mixed. So a number of years ago, the research basically said it was more favorable for boys. But since, especially, kind of in the early 1900s, but since 1960, we've seen more declines in the advantages. So boys may have a more favorable body image and might be more popular, but they still are more at risk for some of those kind of high-risk problematic behaviors. So basically, I think what we want to keep in mind is that we can't always control the timing of puberty, but if we have a child who's going through puberty early, we just want to realize that daughters and sons might need more parental monitoring and also more support and warmth. All right, so let's talk about brain development during adolescence. So once again, we're revisiting this concept of plasticity and synaptic overproduction and pruning. So just like our brains went through a period of this in early childhood, like between the ages of 0 and 3, we have a resurgence of this overproduction and pruning, the synaptogenesis, in adolescence. And this is because the increased sex hormones promote new neurons, plasticity, and myelination. And so this overproduction or synaptogenesis starts around ages 10 to 12. It peaks around 12. And then you have pruning from 12 into your mid-20s. And the adolescent and early adulthood brain is really primed to seek out novelty, which allows teens and emerging adults to have more experiences that the brain can really benefit from. And so we'll talk about that. This is because your brain is more plastic during this time, not only if you don't use potential connections, you'll lose them, but if you use potential connections, you could really improve them. So this is a time to, study hard and, have kind of profound experiences that can really shape your brain. And so experiences that are repeated in adolescence are more likely to be myelinated. Myelination actually does make the brain a little less plastic or changeable. It creates more efficient and secure connections that are less likely to be pruned. And so this has implications for repeated positive or negative experiences during adolescence, which we'll talk more about. So I'm drawing information on the adolescent brain from this excellent book by Lawrence Sternberg called The Age of Opportunity, which I'd encourage you to read, and I encouraged my son to read some of too. So the brain is more about reorganization than growth, because generally we have reached adult levels of brain size prior to adolescence, but the brain is reorganizing itself. And so some of the things that are happening, the areas that we see the most reorganization and plasticity, according to Sternberg, are these the 3 R's: the reward system, the relationship system, and the regulatory system. And so starting with the reward system, puberty basically triggers an increase in dopamine receptors in the reward system and makes basically reward and pleasurable pathways more easily activated, and basically a more intensive dopamine kind of squirt, really, for pleasurable experiences like substances or, doing kind of crazy things. That's why it's so thrilling to do crazy things in adolescence, even simple things like hanging your head out of the car and yelling, that you might not do when you're in your 30s, but can seem quite rewarding and fun, when you're a teenager. And so this has implications actually for substance use. Regular substance use during adolescence is highly rewarding to the reward system, and it can permanently alter reward system functioning. So I always recommend that it's better to wait for regular substance use. Try not to make anything a daily habit, until you're over 25. Okay, so then the reward system also ties to the relationship system. So this is also an area that's we're seeing increasing brain development with more of a focus on relationships, whether that's friendships or romantic relationships. And this can be tied into the reward system and how relationships can be particularly rewarding. But they can also be stressful, and that ties into the regulatory system. So during ages basically of adolescence and emerging adulthood, the brain is more sensitive to stress. Most mental health issues occur or onset between the ages of 10 and 25. If you've not developed a mental health issue before 25, like anxiety or depression, then you're or substance use abuse, you're much less likely to develop it as you get older. So it's a higher risk time, but it's also a high time of opportunity because the brain is more plastic now. It's also more responsive to treatment. And so generally what's recommended is if you're struggling with something for longer than 2 weeks in terms of anxiety or depression, it's a great idea to seek treatment before something gets kind of entrenched in your brain, because fears that we acquire during adolescence are harder to get rid of later. So there's basically pros and cons here. So Sternberg divides the adolescent and emerging adult brain development into these 3 phases. The first one, phase 1, is called starting the engine. So this with the initial physical changes that happen in puberty, like we talked about, the limbic system is undergoing a number of changes in kind of how it responds to rewards, threats, relationships, emotion. Now we move on to phase 2, which he refers to as the better braking system. And so it starts before puberty, but it's not complete until about 16. And this is in your prefrontal cortex. This is kind of your regulatory system, your executive function, like we talked about. And so basically the limbic system comes online faster than the prefrontal cortex. And so you get better metaphorically at pushing on the gas than you do before you get better at pushing on the brakes. But in phase 3, you become basically a more skilled at kind of managing these two systems, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, you have increased synapses or connections between those, and basically better regulatory behavior. But you can see this isn't generally considered to be complete until early 20s, maybe even 25. So let's shift our attention to talking about sleep. Puberty causes a shift in sleep-wake patterns during adolescence. So on average, adolescents start to feel more alert in the evening, particularly males, and more tired in the morning. And so this interestingly has puts some risk basically for delinquency, because you're kind of awake and wired at night and more likely to get into trouble. And then because your sleep-wake cycle gets off because you're staying up late but then having to get up early for school, you end up experiencing more sleep deprivation. And this has implications for a lot of high-risk behaviors, for driving and getting into accidents, for substance use, for sexual behavior. It also has implications for academic performance. So the sleep researcher Matthew Walker has pointed out that moving to early school start times, for example, generally reduce car accidents, because kids aren't so sleep deprived. They also improve test scores, particularly for those morning classes when kids are tired. And they also reduce suicide rates, because sleep deprivation and mental health and suicidality are also correlated. And so you can see some of the research up there that says, compared to teens who sleep more than 8 hours, teens who sleep less than 8 hours are much more likely to use substances, engage in other risky behaviors, self-harm, or attempt suicide. So this theme will come up as we move through emerging adulthood and adulthood, but the importance of sleep for basically all areas of development. Just like exercise, sleep is important for physical, cognitive, and social and emotional development. So eating disorders are more common in cultures that emphasize slimness. There was a study done in Fiji, I think that's talked about in your textbook, where to track what happened before they had kind of basically Western television and then after, and they found that once kind of Western television came to the island, then body image issues and eating disorders increased. And obviously body image issues and disordered eating is all on a continuum, or on continua, and we all kind of range on that. And many of us may have some aspects of our body image or our eating that's not perfect, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we meet the criteria for an eating disorder. However, lots of us do. I know lots of people who have struggled with eating disorders. And so talking first about anorexia just briefly, and then more on the next slide. Anorexia is associated with the inability to maintain body weight, an intense fear of weight gain, becoming so thin that generally there's a lack of menstruation for females, viewing food as problematic or making you sick. Not generally, when we have anorexia, we don't recognize our behavior as problematic, and we can't accurately see our bodies. We may be very thin, but we still think we look fat. In bulimia, there's also a fear of weight gain, and it's more associated with binge eating and purging. Even if that's with vomiting, that can damage our teeth over time. People who are struggling with bulimia tend to usually have a more normal weight, and they recognize that their eating patterns are more abnormal, and tend to kind of go in and out of the pattern, whereas anorexia appears to be more stable. And then I also just want to mention compulsive exercise. It's not an official DSM disorder, but it often co-occurs with anorexia, and bulimia, is related to obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is basically, exercising excessively in order to try to maintain thinness, and having intense guilt or anxiety if miss exercise. And so one former student shared in the class that he, if he didn't exercise, he would get up. He'd feel so guilty he couldn't go to sleep, and finally he'd get up at 3 in the morning and go for a 5-mile run. right? Now here in Colorado, it's really hard to figure out what's normal exercise and what's compulsive because we've got people doing so many crazy things. So again, this can be a little bit challenging to figure out. Okay, so then we'll talk more about treatment options for anorexia on the next slide, but generally we have options for psychotherapy, some medication, and even hospitalization if needed. The effectiveness on, for eating disorder treatment says that it's pretty challenging to treat. At least half of individuals treated for bulimia relapse. And people who have struggled with this early on continue to, perhaps because their physiology or even kind of their neural connections have shifted, and it can be hard to change those back as they get older. Okay, so anorexia nervosa is one of the deadliest psychological disorders. It affects just about 1% of the population at the clinical level. Often has an early onset in adolescence. People can struggle with it for decades, and it can obviously create damage to a lot of different parts of the body. In terms of treatment, at least a third of people treated for anorexia still kind of struggle and aren't able to recover. We have tried a lot of specialized treatments for anorexia, cognitive behavioral therapy, family-based treatment, medication treatments. We haven't found one that just is a specialized treatment that really stands out, although I still always recommend that if you have an eating disorder to try going to clinics that specialize in eating disorders, because I think they have the best kind of training and you kind of have your best chances there. Let's see, so in terms of why some people struggle more than others, so the risk factors are being high on neuroticism, so that's basically something similar to anxiety, and it can be something that's genetic. Being female, so the ratio of females to males diagnosed is about 9-to-1. Higher SES, white-collar households are more at risk than working class. Adolescents are the most likely, and then of course anything else going on with parents, their own mental health issues, or having been in foster care, having been adopted, and coming from a Western culture. So let's talk about why teens and perhaps the rest of us use substances too. So the first reason is to feel good, right? So we already talked about dopamine and the reward systems, and so many substances operate on the reward systems and kind of basically promote dopamine release or prevent its reuptake, so you feel kind of heightened sense of pleasure and anticipation of a reward in using the substance. Sometimes we're doing it to feel better, right? We're self-medicating for anxiety, depression, or stress. Sometimes we're doing it to do better, like taking our friend's Adderall to improve our cognitive or athletic performances. And then, of course, in adolescence, because the reward system is more activated, we're doing it because it's thrilling, because it's exciting, because it provides a big rush, maybe because we're curious, because our friends are doing it, because we have a personality type that kind of is more approach, right, and a little bit more impulsive. So this relates back to what we talked about with the Lawrence Sternberg kind of brain development, in the sense that the reward system develops before the prefrontal cortex. And so using the driving metaphor again, you can push on the gas better before you can push on the brake. And so this means that you're more likely to be impulsive, more risky during adolescence, which predisposes you to using substances. And then with the emphasis on relationships in adolescence and emerging adulthood, we know that when we're in the presence of peers, we generally are more likely to engage in risky behavior. Even juvenile male rats, for example, do crazier things when they're with their friend rats than when they're by themselves. And so this puts adolescents at risk for substance abuse, developing substance abuse disorders, like we've mentioned already. And so starting cannabis use prior to age 15 is more linked to long-term poor cognitive functioning, and the longer you can delay your use of alcohol, your odds of developing a substance abuse disorder around alcohol decrease. So this graph just shows us that compared to many other developed countries, adolescents, this is 15-year-olds in the US, are showing lower cigarette and alcohol use, generally because we've had higher anti-smoking campaigns and more restrictions on the places that you can smoke. And yet still about 20% of teens are smoking cigarettes. And of that 20%, 80% will go on to smoking in adulthood. And then because we have higher drinking age, right, we see lower alcohol use. All right, so now that we're done with physical development in adolescence, let's move on to cognitive development. Okay, so now we're into Piaget's last stage of cognitive development, which was called formal operations in adolescence. And so basically, adolescents get better at what's called hypothetical deductive reasoning. This is basically like scientific thinking is how I think about it. And so adolescents get better at solving problems, more complex problems. And so one example that Piaget used was called the pendulum problem, where the question was, what determines this speed of a pendulum at the end of a string, the speed at which it swings? Is it the length of the string, the weight of the pendulum, or the height from which the weight is dropped? Basically, if you give this task to younger children, they aren't as methodical. They might change the length and the weight at the same time, right? Or the height and the weight at the same time. Whereas adolescents realize that in order to problem solve accurately, you've got to hold everything constant except for one element and just change it. So the answer to this question, by the way, is it's the length of the string that influences the swinging speed of the pendulum. We do see individual differences. So some adolescents who are more focused on math and science exhibit higher levels of formal operations. Certainly we might see some cultural differences. This is really starting to happen around the ages of 11 or 12. Okay, so let's talk about information processing. And again, remember this, whenever we talk about information processing, it's attention and memory. And so during adolescence, teenagers get better at both selective attention and divided attention. So selective attention is how you focus in on the most relevant information, how you focus in on what your friend is texting you and drown out your annoying brother in the background, or how you focus in on what your teacher is saying and ignore the person who's online shopping next to you. Divided attention is being able to focus on multiple things at once. So watch TV and do your homework. Adolescents are better at this than middle-aged adults, but still we know that people aren't as good at focusing on multiple things as they are at just focusing in on one thing. There are individual differences in how good we are at selective attention and divided attention, and whether or not we're better at one or another. And so there's a fun selective attention test there that's linked up, or you could just put in selective attention test on YouTube and by Daniel Simons, and it'll pop up to get a sense of that. I, for example, noticed that I'm very good at selective attention, but not so great at divided attention. And one way that I notice this is when I'm out, like let's say hiking or walking with friends, they seem to notice things that are happening around us. Oh, look over there at that. Whereas I never notice what is happening around us, because I am just focusing on our conversation, what they're saying or what I'm saying. And so I'm really good at tuning into that, but not so good at kind of multitasking with my attention. Adolescents also improve memory because we remember those memory strategies we talked about in middle childhood. Adolescents use these more, and they also have, again, that bigger knowledge base, more kind of schemes or a file folder structure developed in their brain to kind of organize new information that they're taking in. So now we're on to adolescent egocentrism, and probably two of the more famous concepts in human development, and that's the imaginary audience and the personal fable. And I bet you've learned about them before. So imaginary audience is this idea that adolescents and to a large extent, the rest of us too, right, assume that people are noticing things about us. So because adolescents are thinking about themselves so much, they assume that everyone else is also thinking about them and noticing their flaws, for example. So when I was that age, I was embarrassingly really into beauty, and I would go to the library because there wasn't any internet and check out all the books on beauty or borrow my friends, 17 magazines. And I remember seeing something in a magazine that showed two models from behind, one with scuffed heels and shoes and scaly ankles and a wrinkled skirt and the messy back part of her hair, and the other with perfection. And it was this idea that imagine that you don't realize what you look like from behind, and imagine that you need to kind of fix all of your flaws. And I always think that that's why I didn't learn anything in middle school, because I was just thinking about whether or not my ankles were red and scuffy. But then I also just even noticed, like when my son started 6th grade, the night before he started 6th grade, all of a sudden he was like, "Mom, I need a new backpack and I need new clothes and I need to fix my hair," right? And there's that sense that if you don't get it right, everyone's going to be staring at you. Personal fable is also a form of basically egocentrism and kind of, thinking about yourself. But in this way, you imagine that you're really unique, right? That you're special. This is why during adolescence, we can have an unrealistic belief that we'll be famous. This is also why we think no one understands us, right? So this puts us, at risk for false hopes of being famous, and also this sense of being isolated, that no one else gets us, which can put us more at risk for depression and anxiety and suicidality. Can also influence riskier behavior because we believe that we're special and bad things won't happen to us. And I read teen fiction, and this, really, or, as it's called, YA, young adult fiction, and this really furthers the personal fable, because in all the teen fiction books that I read, the protagonist never dies, right? The sidekicks die, but the protagonist can do risky, crazy things, and they're not going to die. And another way that I really think about personal fable is there's this common theme, right, of being just an average girl, right? You look really normal, but in fact you have superpowers and two hot guys who are attracted to you. So I always tell my husband, if I could just clone him and make one of him a bad boy, my life would be perfect. So I think that I must have an unresolved personal fable if I just want to keep reading teen fiction. All right, let's move into emotional and social development in adolescence. So there's something called the experience sampling method, which is basically a type of research where you give individuals an electronic device. It used to be something like a BlackBerry, and now it's often just an iPod Touch or something like that, where it beeps at them many different times a day, and they have to answer quick questions about their emotional experiences. And what researchers have found from doing these types of studies is that adolescents report kind of more emotional extremes in one day as compared to adults. So they can be, super happy or super down, kind of all in one day. And they also report more of those emotions that we associate with adolescence, like being self-conscious, embarrassed, moody, lonely, or nervous. And so, again, some of these emotional extremes are the things reasons why adolescents are more at risk for suicide, because you don't have as much experience with all these emotions. And you don't always realize that just because you don't feel like you're never going to be happy again, you actually, will be. This has been mostly studied in the US, but even in other places like India, teens also have shown more emotional extremes than adults. Okay, so what you can also see is that compared to, or from 5th grade basically to 12th grade, we see an average decline in positive emotions like being happy or proud or feeling great. And certainly hormones are a factor here, and but also cognition is a factor, because now you're able to think more complexly and abstractly and more deeply about yourself or your family or the world. It's kind of a loss of innocence, a sense that bad things can happen in the world. School often becomes more challenging. And so those can be all factors where we might see more of a decline in happiness that will then begin to kind of go back up as we move into adulthood. Okay, so we talked about adolescence being a time of identity development, and so self-concept is really a part of that, where we're trying to kind of figure out who we are. And researchers have suggested that our self-concept is composed of our actual self, which is our true self, as well as some possible selves and a false self. So let's talk through all these, and I'll give my examples, and you can be thinking about what yours would be. So your actual self during adolescence, or your true self. So for me, during adolescence, I was an honors student. I was a good kid. I was more introverted. I was a little stubborn. I was kind of intense, truthfully. In terms of possible selves, that's who you're thinking about you might be or could be. So your ideal self is who you want to be, and most of us introverts in adolescence wanted to be more extroverted or more wild or more hip. And also another possible self is what we're afraid of being, or our feared self. So I was, of course, afraid of being an awkward geek who would never have a date. And then we have our false self, which is basically what we show to potential romantic partners. So even though I was kind of actually fairly intense, I was really just nice and calm and sweet to any potential dating partners. And so we could imagine that the greater the discrepancy between our actual selves and our ideal selves, the more we kind of have a sense of failure or depression or lower self-worth, lower self-esteem. And I think it's interesting to figure out how we figure out who we are. And I would kind of pose that question to you. How have you figured out who you are? How do you know what's your true self? And things that students have said in the past is, when you change environments, you can see what stays the same about yourself, and that gives you a sense of who your true self is. Or the words that people use to describe you, if there's words that kind of get consistently used across environments, that perhaps, and over time, that gives you a sense of your true self. So something to ponder. So research on self-esteem in adolescence says it's can be composed of a number of dimensions. And so you can get a global self-esteem score, like your overall self-esteem, or it can be broken down into different categories or domains. And so this is based on Susan Harder's work to develop 8 domains of adolescent self-image. So scholastic is, the example of that is I'm pretty intelligent. Social might be answering positively to I have a lot of friends. Athletic, does well at many sports. Appearance, happy with the way I look. Job, have skills to do a job. Romantic appeal, people my age are attracted to me. Behavior, don't get into trouble. Close friendship, I have a close friend to share secrets. And so you might also ask yourself, what are the domains that are most correlated with overall global self-esteem, or most predictive, right, of overall self-esteem? And so, or what are the 2 most important areas would be another way to ask that question. And so on average, it's physical appearance and social acceptance. Sometimes romantic, and especially for girls. High self-esteem about appearance tends to correlate with high self-esteem overall. And so one thing that I think is an interesting takeaway here is that as parents, we could just understand that even though we might not love a focus on appearance, it's a normal part of adolescent development and self-esteem. And so maybe this is a time where you let your kids spend more on their appearance, whether that's clothes or shoes or, hair products. An example in my life is, my son, who's not super concerned about a lot of this, when he decided he wanted to get his hair cut like once a month, and I said, fine, like do what you need to do, because I kind of understand, even though I think that's a little excessive, right? If that's what makes you feel good about yourself, that's fine. Okay, so let's talk about parental conflict during adolescence. So conflicts with parents generally increase, especially from about the age of 12 to 16 or 17. This graph actually shows mothers and sons. It was based on a study that videotaped interactions over an 8-year period. And so we might ask, why is this? Why does conflict increase? and then begin to decline. And so basically it seems to be around autonomy, right? This is an increasing time for adolescents to want autonomy, but parents have worries about all the potential dangerous things that can happen during adolescence and fears of giving up control. And so there's so many things that we parents have to worry about during adolescence. And so let's just, talk about them for a second here. These can be things like sexual assault, pregnancy, substance abuse, driving under the influence of substances, depression, anxiety, suicidality, being homicidal. I'm sure I'm forgetting things, poor academic grades and you won't get into college, eating disorders, bullying, right? There's this huge list of things that can happen during adolescence that really weren't very likely to happen during middle childhood, that can really alter your life trajectory. And so parents get pretty freaked out about that and want to have more control at a time when adolescents are wanting a lot of autonomy. At the same time, conflicts do help to kind of renegotiate parental authority. During this time, we as parents have to realize we don't have as much control as we would like. They do create more egalitarianism. They do promote autonomy. And so we can think of conflict as more positive, where there's more kind of benefits to the overall relationship quality, or more negative. So we're trying to avoid lots of attack and criticism and shut down, which could more negatively affect relationship quality. So in terms of parental conflict around the world, we do see higher rates of conflict in individualistic cultures because we have that emphasis on independence, on autonomy, and we see less conflict in collectivist cultures, which emphasize more that interdependence, what's best for the group harmony, and basically submission to authority or elders. But we still do see increased rates of parental conflict with adolescents and parents, even in collectivist cultures. Let's talk for a minute about how relationships between parents and teens influence later romantic relationships. So this is another differential susceptibility study, and it was a longitudinal study following parents and teens, or following individuals from basically the age of 15 to around their early 30s. And so it video recorded them having a problem-solving discussion when they were 15 with one of their parents, and then another problem-solving discussion like 15 years later with a romantic partner. And so what you can see then is that for the orchids, and this was a genetic differential susceptibility study investigating a number of different plasticity alleles. You can see down there it says cumulative genetic index score, so it was up to 8 different plasticity alleles. And so the ones that were the most orchid-like, who had the most basically plasticity alleles, who were the most sensitive to their environment, then the level of hostility that they were showing in their interaction, or that their parents and them were showing in their interaction, and that could be hostility, coercion, kind of antisocial behavior, the more that was happening between themselves and their parent, the more likely that they would be having hostility in a romantic relationship 15 years later. And I don't have that up here on this graph, but if it was more positive, positive interactions with their parents were highly correlated with more positive interactions with a romantic partner. So the orchids are heavily influenced by their interactions with their parents. Dandelions, you can see there, not so much. It was the true dandelions who had 0 plasticity alleles, didn't have any differences, any correlation between parental hostility and romantic relationships hostility. So if it was parental hostility was really low or really high, it didn't matter. They were just in the average for romantic relationship hostility. And this also shows us that there are some adolescents who are more responsive to intervention. And so those, again, are going to be the orchids. This was a study of African American teens in rural Georgia, and they were pre-tested at around age 11. They received a family intervention, and then they were post-tested around age 14. And they went through this basically family group intervention, where they had kind of skill building sessions, and then individually and together with their parents. And then it was studied what their substance use risk was over time. And what you can see is that those who didn't have risk genes didn't see that much change with or without intervention, but those who had increasing numbers of risk genes or plasticity alleles, as we've talked about, if they didn't have the intervention, if they were the control group, then their risk for substance use, for alcohol use, went increasingly up the more plasticity alleles that they had. And if they did get the intervention, then their risk went down. So even though romantic relationships are a huge part of adolescence, we're just going to briefly touch on them here because we're going to spend our last lecture of the semester on romantic relationships in emerging adulthood. So we'll focus in on it a whole bunch. But basically, this is becoming an increasing feature around the world during adolescence. And you can see kind of the stats there about how much the increase is in terms of romantic relationships between 7th grade and 11th grade. Less maybe focus on dating and more on talking or hanging out. Your book would suggest something like feelings of passion are universal, right, around the world, across cultures. But then we do have to ask, because we're, becoming more aware of this, what about people who might identify as aromantic or asexual? And again, we don't have much research on that, but we might imagine that we'll see more of that coming. Okay, so let's talk about sexuality, pregnancy, and culture. So around the world, in terms of teen pregnancy, we can divide cultures into 3 groups: permissive cultures, which have low rates of teen pregnancy; semi-restrictive cultures, which have the highest rates of teen pregnancy; and restrictive cultures, which also have low rates of teen pregnancy. So examples of permissive cultures are like Northern Europe, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, that might kind of just accept that adolescents are having sex. They might let romantic partners spend the night. They might provide kind of easy access to contraception. And then on the other side, we have restrictive cultures like Asian, Arabic, or South American cultures, where teens are given, little kind of unsupervised time where they could potentially have sexual intimacy, and so thus there are low rates of teen pregnancy. And then we have cultures like the US, where we're semi-restrictive, where we kind of have basically mixed feelings. We have ambiguous messages about teen sexuality. Basically, sex is everywhere kind of in our culture, but we also kind of don't want to talk to teens about sex because we might kind of inadvertently encourage it. I'm going to give you a chance to watch this video, and let me just say a little bit about it here. I always feel somewhat ambivalent about showing this video in class. It's a little bit edgy, so you can tell me if you think it was inappropriate. It does contain kind of explicit sexual references. It is heterosexist. It's really just focused on kind of the examples that it's giving is more of heterosexual adolescent boys and girls, or young men and women, but maybe some of this could be translated to same-sex partners as well. And I think one of the takeaways from the TED Talk is just that, and why I keep showing it, I think is the important message is that we often don't talk to people, especially young women, about what it feels like to be sexual, or to be able to, how to have an orgasm during sexual interactions. And so I just think it's important that we make that a priority as well. Okay, so let's talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender adolescents. And this research is more focused on Western cultures. And so what we're seeing, and you all know all this, right, is that LGBT youth are more likely to come out at an earlier age and less likely to be waiting until later in life to do that. So that's kind of the good news. And adolescents and emerging and young adults are less likely to feel like they have to put themselves always in a box or have a rigid definition, and might be able to have some more fluidity around sexuality or gender identity. Yet at the same time, we still are seeing that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and particularly transgender youth are more at risk for rejection from parents and others, more at risk for suicide, also more at risk for physical assault. So more bullying, yet also increasing parental acceptance. So kind of, again, good news, bad news.
We'll be talking more about identity development in general once we get to emerging adulthood. But this is a common stage model of sexual orientation identity development based on gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer adolescents, as well as emerging adults. And these, stages are the most typical progression, as you can see, going from attraction to questioning to identifying to sexual activity to coming out to a romantic relationship. But of course, not everyone does it this way or in this order. People might have sexual activity before they, self-identify, for example. They might enter into a romantic relationship before they've, really come out. And there's some mean ages here, and these are based on a meta-analysis by Hall and colleagues that was published in 2021 of 30 studies. But you can see the data was collected between 1987 and 2015, and when we think about kind of our awareness around sexual orientation and how it's changing, it's likely that, these ages are going to continue to become younger. So this is a newer model that combines gender identity and sexual orientation in the context of other intersecting identities like race, culture, religion, ability, status. So let's talk through some of these. So developing gender and sexual orientation identity. This could be exploring options for changing one's identity, expression, or body, finding the term or labels that one might prefer. Awareness, repression, acceptance. This is becoming aware that one's own sexual orientation isn't straight or your gender isn't cis. Sharing identities with friends and family. So maybe someone, and this can be a repetitive kind of emerging process. So maybe first you come out as non-binary, then as a transgender man, then as also queer or gay. And with each of those kind of sharing of identities, there's varying experiences of support and rejection, depending upon who it is that you're talking with and what identity you're sharing. Developing an intimacy status. So this is this idea that we are often exploring sexuality while navigating kind of this interplay between sexual orientation and gender identity. So maybe I thought I was attracted to women, but really I was a man wanting to be a woman. And once I became a woman, I wasn't as attracted to women anymore. And then that bottom kind of category, entering and exiting community, first maybe someone moves into a community of kind of a queer community. And then they decide, no, it's really more transgender men. And so people may feel like, as they progress through their identity development, they have to give up other communities, along the way.
All right, so thinking about work in developed countries, teens are less likely to be working to support their families, but certainly can be happening. This is much more common in developing countries. And basically, working less than 10 hours a week generally has more benefits for a sense of responsibility or time management or building skills or kind of a self-esteem around jobs. But working more than 10 hours a week is correlated with lower grades, less sports performance or involvement, less sleep, and increased use of substance. And the reason why these things all could go together is it could be that school isn't such a great thing for you, and so you spend more time at work. Or it could be that because you're spending more time at work, you don't have enough time to focus on school. It can also be that at work you end up hanging out with an older crowd than you would at school, and so you might get involved in substance use that you wouldn't otherwise. Or it could be that you're using substances because you're sleep deprived and you kind of need them to kind of manage how you feel. Okay, so crime and delinquency generally peak around age 18 and then decline. So if you were to just ask a group of adolescent males, 75% would check something on a list that was technically a crime, and that would be maybe drinking or vandalism or minor theft or something like that. These aren't necessarily things that people got arrested for, but would just kind of admit to. Yet when we think about crimes, the majority of them are committed by just a subset of adolescents, and those are males, ages 12 to 25. And so that kind of throws off the statistics for everybody, but it's really just a small group that is kind of committing the crimes. And so why is this? Definitely a testosterone surge is kind of correlated with more aggressive or risky behavior. And we talked about that as even a gender difference, that young males are more likely to show kind of higher impulsivity than young females. When we think about crime and delinquency, there's basically two trajectories. There's people who are males who are getting into trouble during adolescence who are going to continue to get into trouble throughout their lives. And that's generally because something is kind of going, there's something more persistent in either neurological development or the environmental situation. So maybe they've got something going on neurologically with ADHD or a learning disability or higher impulsivity, or a difficult, temperament that is predisposing them, or kind of lower intellectual functioning, which is predisposing them to crime. Or perhaps, it's environmental factors like living in a higher crime environment or having peers that are engaging in more delinquent behavior. And then there are those who are just really getting into trouble in adolescence but aren't going to go on to get into trouble in adulthood, which is like the majority of people admitting to crimes during adolescence. So in terms of treatment for delinquent activity and crimes during adolescence, I want to remind you again of the Bromberg-Brenner bioecological perspective. That was the different kind of concentric rings, microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem. You remember that. And so some of our models of how we treat delinquency use basically elements of all kind of elements of an adolescent's microsystem. And so instead of just thinking that the problem exists in the adolescent, people working from what's called multisystemic therapy, or MST, which is an evidence-based treatment program, try to intervene with family, with peers, in the school environment, in the neighborhood. So in all kind of aspects of the microsystem. So multisystemic therapy is an intensive home-based family therapy program for juvenile offenders and their families, and basically tries to use kind of all elements of their support system to create change. Treatment on average lasts for about 5 months, and basically these families have a therapist who's on call for them 24/7 whenever issues arise. And what you can see there is that multisystemic therapy has been kind of effective in reducing arrests, or what's called recidivism, and the necessity of out-of-home placements.
So your book doesn't mention anxiety, at least in adolescence, but it is the most common mental health issue in youth, meaning children and adolescents. It's twice the rate of depression. So in any given year, 7% of youth ages 3 to 17 would have an anxiety diagnosis. And if we look at, if we ask people, who are older, if they met the criteria for an anxiety disorder between the ages of 3 and 17, maybe 20 to 30% would have. Anxiety disorders are characterized by excessive worry, so beyond just kind of the everyday worries it's hard to control. It's leading to clinically significant distress, right? It's interfering with your ability to go about your day. It's associated with some physical and cognitive symptoms. In children, this can be, or in youth, this can be restlessness, feeling keyed up, being easily fatigued, having difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, or sleep disturbance. And so you have to have at least some of these symptoms regularly, like more days than not, for about 6 months. Anxiety is less likely to be treated than depression, even though it's more common. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the most common form, which often involves, kind of articulating and confronting our fears. Medication is also an option, usually involving serotonin. And then in terms of various anxiety disorders, they often occur at different times during childhood and adolescence. So separation anxiety disorders are more common in early childhood, phobias more common during middle childhood, social anxiety more common during later middle childhood and adolescence, and then generalized anxiety, panic, and agoraphobia, fear of leaving the house basically, is more common in later adolescence and emerging adulthood.
Okay, so let's talk about depression, and we're going to revisit mental health when we get to emerging adulthood. So it's really common for all of us to experience some depressed mood, right? But to qualify for a major depressive disorder, it's still, decently common, but overall less common. So you have to have multiple symptoms you have to basically have felt, low energy and low enjoyment in life most every day, most all of the day, for a 2-week period. And so most of the time when we experience depression, it's not quite that intense. So there is a higher incidence of depression in adolescence compared to childhood. Anxiety starts earlier than depression, but depression is more likely to come on in adolescence, perhaps because of more complex thinking, conflict in the parent-child relationship, increased stress. Girls are at higher risk for depression and report more depression. Females do throughout the lifespan. And depression has many potential causes. It's not just a simple answer. It could be because of the stress of development. It could be the influence of sex hormones. It could be conflict with parents. It could be reaction to a stressful event like the death of a friend or a relative, or a romantic breakup, or failures at school. Let's see, other things that could be factors might be child abuse, struggling with social skills, learning disabilities, chronic illnesses, harsh parenting, and then many adolescents with depression might also have other co-occurring disorders, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, eating disorders. And so in terms of treatment, again, like we talked about, because the adolescent brain is so sensitive and it's more plastic, we don't want an adolescent to struggle with depression for very long. So within a couple of weeks, if it seems serious, we want to take some action. And of course, as a therapist, my first step is always getting someone increased social support and seeing what we can do with therapy, individual and family therapy. Because isolation is one of the biggest, predictors of depression. And then, of course, there are antidepressant medications. That's not the first thing I would go to. I would try therapy or counseling first. But then, of course, lots of people do feel a lot of relief with antidepressants, and it can kind of change that brain chemistry and keep things from getting more entrenched. Or even a combination of therapy and medication. And I always recommend that people see psychiatrists rather than just their family doctor for antidepressants. because psychiatrists are a specialized type of medical doctor or an MD who really focuses in on psychopharmacology. And so they're going to be the best at figuring out, they're going to have the latest research on what's the best antidepressant and dose and be able to work with you in really dialing that in. Okay, so let's revisit differential susceptibility as related to depression and parenting again. And so what we can see here is that for the orchids who had more plasticity alleles, they had the most or least depression depending upon the amount of negative parenting that they experienced. So if they had a lot of negative parenting, they had the highest rates of depression. If they had a lot of positive parenting, they had the lowest rates of depression. Whereas dandelions' level of depression was in the middle, more average, and was unaffected by whether their parenting was more negative or more positive. And then relatedly, talking about kind of the positives in terms of family support and depression, this study was found that for adolescent boys, those that this was another genetic study using the HTT-LPR gene associated with serotonin, the 5-HTT-LPR gene associated with serotonin. Basically, the boys who were the orchids really responded to family support and had the lowest rates of depression. Those who didn't have family support had the highest rates of depression. And then the dandelions, you can see their level of support didn't influence their level of depression. So again, it's the good news, bad news, right? Orchids are going to be more susceptible to the negative, but also more influenced by the positive. So we talk about resilience quite a bit in HDFS, and it's defined as having positive outcomes in spite of experiencing adversity or threats to adaptation. And so we're always trying to figure out how we can maximize people's protective factors to increase their resiliency. And so here's some protective factors for adolescents. So having higher intelligence, or having an environment that supports intelligence, physical attractiveness. So again, as parents, we can kind of support what our kids need to feel good about themselves. We talked about physical self-esteem around appearance, more authoritative parenting, right? That balance of warmth and kindness, having secure attachments to parents. And so this is always kind of surprising to people because they think of adolescence as a time of autonomy, but it's a time of autonomy with a sense of a secure base, that you have kind of a safety net of parents who are available and supportive when you do want to talk to them. Having supportive adult mentors, whether that's parents or teachers or coaches or pastors, and religiosity can be a protective factor, church attendance or involvement in a youth group. Okay, so I've always found the family dinner research to be a little bit interesting and have looked into it more. So you've probably heard kind of those findings in the media where kids who eat dinner with their family have better outcomes, whether that's lower rates of obesity or kind of lower rates of delinquency or depression. And because for many years, my family, my husband and I, we weren't that great at family dinner, I think for a couple of reasons. Obviously, well, we were really busy working. Our kids were super picky eaters, and we often didn't want to eat chicken nuggets or macaroni and cheese, so we were kind of making separate things for them. We were often exercising in the evening, which made it harder for us to want to eat when the kids wanted to eat. So anyway, I was always hoping that maybe it was just time together as a family, that just, reading stories, playing games, having fun was as good as family dinner. And definitely family time in general is beneficial for kids and adolescents. But what the research says is that family dinner seems to add something extra. And so we've gotten better about doing family dinner in more recent years. And I do think it's something that my kids would say they kind of benefit from above and beyond just the things we do together as a family.